everybody. Julian Assange, WikiLeaks. For some, just those few words epitomise danger. Still, here we are tonight talking about WikiLeaks and talking to Julian Assange. And we're talking about WikiLeaks not just to dwell on what it's achieved so far, and that is significant, a rewriting of the rules of official secrets, of journalism, of the citizen's right to know. And we're not just talking about what WikiLeaks has been doing in the last few weeks, because that's incredible too. The public release of 250,000 diplomatic cables, every single one of them with secrets stamped all over them. So we are talking here tonight about the future of the WikiLeaks project and the suggestion, as Simon said, that WikiLeaks has not gone far enough. There is more to do. Only 5 years ago, and I know some of you know this story, that Julian Assange, the legend has it, wrote the word WikiLeaks on a whiteboard in his Melbourne terrace home, giving name to a concept that would really shake the world, embarrass governments, embarrass big business, shame those in power into backdowns, into cover-ups, into apologies, into excuses, and ultimately into threats. Julian Assange is called variously brave, brilliant, a crusading revolutionary, and secretive, paranoid, and yes, even dangerous. And for a man who spends a lot of his life in the shadows, really, in the back rooms, devising computer models, secret passwords, encrypting information so others can drop in their leaked documents and their secrets, we know an awful lot about him. His life is now extremely public. We know about his childhood, or some of it. We know he was a teenage hacker. We know a little bit about his loves, even. We know about his enemies. We even know it all started with that Commodore 64, and aren't we thankful for that? For many, he is a hero. He is the deserving recipient, for instance, of accolades like the Sydney Peace Prize. For others, well, they see him as a terrorist. Some have even said out loud they wish that a drone could move in and take him out. Dangerous indeed. Could you please welcome now, live by satellite from Ellingham Hall in Norfolk in the UK, a very long way away, Julian Assange.
Thank you.
And Julian.
Fran, can you hear me?
And Julian, as you can hear, not just an appreciative crowd, and you haven't even started yet, but a pretty close to a sellout crowd, to a very big crowd here to hear tonight. So over to you.
Thanks. It is heartening to me to hear that kind of response in Australia. The Australian public and its support of our work is really something that keeps us going. The reaction from Washington and London is really very different. And that's something I'd like to explore a little bit, about how different nationalities and different states perceive our work and react to it. 310 days ago, I was in Wandsworth Prison in Winter in London. I was placed into the basement, into the CSU, the separation unit, kept away from all other prisoners, confined to my cell for 24 hours a day. And during that time, I had a moment to reflect upon what had been going on. On the outside world at that time, we had a whole of government task force in Australia set up against us, publicly declared, involving the AFP, ASIS, ASIO, the Department of Defence and the Attorney General. Looking into whether there was any way to stop what we were doing, whether we had committed criminal offences in Australia. And that swift reaction by the Australian government was only stopped by the Australian population and by our friends in the Australian media. It was an expression of democratic discipline. Left to its own device, the Australian government, the Australian Labor cabinet, would have done everything in their power to see me and other people working for WikiLeaks shipped off to the United States. In fact, we received back recently a Freedom of Information request from the Australian government, and some 270 pages produced about us here. The first entry for this particular request is 4 days before the public release of Cablegate on November 29, 2010. So already, before publication, the Australian government was working hand in glove with the United States to try and spin and manipulate and stop our work. You'll notice in this FOI something that is really the cause for WikiLeaks' entire existence. Notice all the black. Notice at the top of these documents, it does not say classified. It says unclassified. Unclassified documents, redacted. Whole of government talking points, back from December the 3rd. Now, you would think, completely irrelevant to any security situation, yet completely redacted. And it is that failure of governments to hold themselves to account, to hold dear to the own mechanisms that they say that they believe in, that means there must be external accountability for the actions of the large and the powerful, and governments are some of the largest and the most powerful in the world. So when I was considering this internal state, the Australian Task Force Against Us and equivalents in the United States, a publicly declared CIA task force, a publicly declared 120-man task force being run by the Pentagon, demands and threats by the Pentagon that we cease publishing, or else we would be compelled to do so, and the mechanism by which we would be compelled, they would not disclose. I asked myself, had I done the right thing? Had in fact I bitten off more than I could chew? I have a strong belief in what we are doing. I have a strong belief in the principles by which we stand for. But had I misplayed the game? Had I made a strategic or tactical error that was so significant that it would mean that we would not be able to pursue our beliefs and objectives anymore, but rather that everything had come to an end? And eventually, when I managed to suss out the bureaucratic system within the Wandsworth prison basement, I got hold of a single book that I wanted to read. Everything else, rather unsurprisingly, is the Express newspaper or the worst kind of mail, Mills and Boon trash. But there, alone on a shelf that I passed when taken to the showers each day, was Cancer Ward by Solzhenitsyn. And when I returned to my cell, I read that book by the great Soviet dissident and novelist. And reading through it, I came to a scene where Oleg, the principal character, based after Solzhenitsyn himself, is sitting in a cancer ward in Siberia, something that happened to him post-exile. And he was speaking to a nurse, and the nurse was asking him for advice. And she speaks the following quote: "The trouble is, my boy is growing up. He asks about everything. How should I bring him up? How should I... The trouble is, my boy is growing up. He asks about everything. How should I bring him up? Should I burden him with the truth? The truth's enough to sink a grown man, isn't it? It's enough to break your ribs." In response, Oleg says confidently, "Burden him with the truth." And that's the situation that I was in and the situation that I believe everyone should be in. We should all be burdened with the truth. Because to not be burdened with the truth is to live a lie. It is to not understand the world around us. It is to be drugged by ignorance or by falsehoods. And as a civilization, not merely as a country, not merely as a group, not merely as an individual, but as a civilization, we cannot live with illusion. If we live with illusion, our entire civilization will end up driving off slowly or quickly some cliff, some uncertain destiny that we cannot see. Some people say, perhaps, that uncertain destiny is global warming. Other people say, perhaps, that destiny is being ruled in a duplicitous way by transnational elites. Other people say it is the market and global capitalism run amok. Others say that it is the rise of Islam. Well, which is it? Which one of these things should we be concerned for as a civilization? Which should we be concerned for as individuals? The only way that we can know is to know what the truth of the matter is. But people don't want to tell us the truth of the matter. People want to conceal the truth of the matter. Is that a representation of the Australian elite, those people intimately involved in power in the Australian Labor Party, operating together as part of a transnational elite with the United States? Is it an example of a security complex, transnational and run amok? Something that is producing papers like this, that is producing actions against us, that all of you are familiar with as a result of press reportage. The only way that we can know is by seeing the truth. Now, the question about what is the truth and who has the truth and how can you determine what is true and what is not is something that we looked at 5 years ago. And my view from studying physics was that it is not possible to determine what is true, but it is possible to determine what is false with enough information. And the best way to determine what is false is to have information that is straight from reality, that is straight from the horse's mouth. And in the case of titanic institutions that have made up our civilization over the last 100 years, for us to understand them properly, we cannot look merely at their public pronouncements. We cannot look at what their leaders say. We cannot look at the information that they pass out under the surface to the fourth estate, to journalists one way or another, to buy favourable press coverage and spin. The proper way to understand them is the same way that physicists understand reality, and that is by seizing on raw experimental data. It is the same way that anatomists understand the human body. It is by cutting it open and looking at what is inside. That is how we have to understand the organisations which comprise our civilization, what their agendas are, how they work, how they interact with each other, and how they all strive in this worldwide environment for power and for domination, and in some cases for cooperation. And while that's a nice theory, is it borne out by the work that we have done in practice? So that's an interesting question. You'll see in response to our labours, and no doubt tonight there will be questions which are speculative in nature, that look forward and say, what if? Can you guarantee? Could this happen? Are you sure this will work? But we don't need to speculate. We can look back upon our 4.5 years of labour, of what we have done over 120 countries, of millions of pages of material released, not just to the public, not just to journalists, but into our shared historical record, into that sacrosanct intellectual book which we all feed from, which influences all of us as we go forward, every decision that we make, every academic decision, every personal decision, every institutional decision. That is our common heritage as human beings. And as information is available from every corner of the earth to every other corner of the earth, it is no longer just an instrument that belongs to one language or to one nation. Rather, it is our shared global intellectual record. By obtaining the information that we have, by helping those who want to speak to the public and speak to that record, we have fleshed out a hidden part of civilization. We have fleshed out that record of how human institutions actually behave that we have been missing for so many years. Now, that's an enviable achievement, and the practical consequences of that are also something that we are proud of. But it is not nearly enough. We have only just begun. We have put into that historical record really less than 1,000th of the serious information that is concealed but needs to be there. The amount of material WikiLeaks has released, what is that a function of? Is it a function merely of our strong belief and our work? No, it is not merely a function of these things. It is a function of the vast number of secrets that have been accumulated. Every day, more and more information is kept concealed because it is so easy to create information and it is so easy to transport information around. The new transnational security elite is forming what academics call a shadow state. That is, a state that administers who has what in terms of wealth and power, and who knows what. That is obvious in the cases that is sometimes obvious in countries like Bulgaria, where the shadow state, comprising intelligence agencies and oil interests and some parts of big business, is often revealed as a result of the work of some other Western countries looking at it. But the shadow state that exists in the United States is a new development. We are not talking about simple patronage networks that have always existed. That have always existed way back to Rome. We are talking about an organized system, not organized in the sense of a classical conspiracy, but logistically organized as a result of top secret, classified, confidential, compartmentalized information networks and agreements between military contractors, which now number in their tens of thousands, and secretive government intelligence agencies operating in the United States, the military, State Department, even USAID. It is not the case that that is simply a Cold War relic that has drifted on. Rather, that is a state, a shadow state, that is expanding dramatically. And it's not just me who is saying this. Dana Priest, a fine reporter at the Washington Post, over a 2-year period, looked at a part of the United States national security shadow state. And she found that there's over 900,000 current top secret US security clearances. That's 1 in 300 people, including children in the United States, have a top secret security clearance. They are part of a small civilization that exists within the United States, that has its own rules, its own words, its own language, its own methodology, that is separate to the rest of the United States. If you include the other security clearances, that's 3.5 million people in the United States are compelled by law and by self-interest to not talk about what they are doing. It is the case now that there is no single individual that is aware of the parts of this national security shadow state. It is properly without oversight because its very mechanism is secrecy. Even the government committees that are set up in the United States to oversee the US intelligence industry are not aware of many of the pieces involved. And that is because of the way classification systems work and the vast amount of information that flows around. Now, if we ask ourselves, how can we tell whether this national security shadow state is gaining power, losing power? Perhaps we're just detecting it now. Perhaps it wasn't something that was easy to see before. And so we think it is a new phenomenon, but really it's an old phenomenon that we've suddenly discovered. Well, we can look at the US national security, we can look at the United States budget. How much of the budget is going towards this shadow state? Is it increasing over time? Or is it decreasing over time? Well, despite US tax revenue falling nearly 20% since before the US financial crisis, we see that in fact that sector, the US national security shadow state, is increasing its take in real terms in the first year of Obama by 6%. In fact, to get elected, Obama had to promise that he would increase military spending by 5% in real terms, while all the rest of the pie is decreasing. And what do we call it when a single organ in a body increases and increases and increases in size, while the rest of the body is becoming more frail and becoming weaker? We call that cancer. That more and more elements of Western governments, it is not just the United States because this is a transnational enterprise, but particularly the United States, more and more elements of the United States are being sucked up and enmeshed into this system. That is a type of governmental cancer. It's a type of system whereby more and more pieces are being sucked into it. And in order to do something significant in the United States or significant in other parts of the world, one has to get a sponsor within that system. In Russia in the 1990s, Putin came in and he tamed the oligarchs. What does that mean? There are approximately 10 points of power in Russia. I lived in Russia for part of the 1990s, and the media in Russia at that time was the freest in the world because each oligarch was an independent pole of power. The KGB was an independent pole of power. All these independent poles of power could put out information out against their enemies and their opponents. But when Putin came in, he drew all the oligarchs under his central pyramid of power. And those that would not conform were evicted from Russia or placed into prison, like Khodorkovsky. A similar thing is happening now in the United States, where in order to do anything meaningful at a high level, one has to have sponsorship from this system. And just 3 weeks ago, the State Department, the entire budget of the State Department, and USAID, which is meant to be an independent national aid body by the United States, which gives foreign aid, were all moved under the national security budget. The pretense about USAID being an independent organisation is completely gone, and the justification for moving USAID and the entire State Department budget into the military budget was that they work hand in hand with military operations around the world. So WikiLeaks has not gone nearly far enough just for that one system. But it's not only this system. There's systems everywhere, in every government, that are like this, that are forming contacts with each other, that are forming part of a new transnational security elite. And until we come to a position whereby every individual can feel safe, completely safe, about communicating directly to the public, every individual can feel completely safe that their private communications with each other cannot be surveilled, then we are not in a position where we have either a society that is free to communicate or that knows itself. And until we know ourselves, until we know the civilization that we're working in, we cannot possibly address the problems of our civilization. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julian. Julian, we have, and everybody, we have about half an hour left in the link-up for some questions, and members of the audience have sent in questions, so I'll try and get some of those across to you. And just, we'll have to work around a bit of delay we've got here, all the way from Norfolk to here. There's a bit of a delay. But just to take it up where you started really there, Julian, and that line from the novel you picked up in the prison, and the question, you know, the statement, "The truth is enough to sink a grown man." Perhaps the question is, as you say, that WikiLeaks has only just begun and the search for truth only just begun. Has it sunk WikiLeaks? Where is WikiLeaks now with its financial lifeline closed down, you know, you essentially under house arrest and with much worse threatening, and the original group that originally managed those cables dissipated? Has WikiLeaks survived?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think at the moment WikiLeaks is a rather big boat with a lot of torpedo holes in it that is taking water and is being bailed out and is moving along, and we're doing our best to keep the thing afloat. The captain's not yet in prison, and most of the staff are still alive, so I think we're not too bad. But the position, the strategic position we were looking at last year was, would we survive? And in fact, should we publish, knowing that we may well not survive the counterattack as a result of publishing? And our decision was, yes, we will publish. We may not survive. We're going to put up a very good fight. We're not going to martyr ourselves needlessly, but we will risk not surviving as an organisation in order to get this information out, because the information that we were publishing is so important, and even if WikiLeaks is destroyed, and it's on the cards that it may be destroyed, other people have been inspired by our work and our example and will continue on and continue to carry the flame, even if we completely go under. Now, that said, we shouldn't assume that other people can easily carry the flame or do so quickly. It is a hard job to do this. It requires a lot of experience, skill and work and money to do it. For example, one of the counterattacks that we've had, the most serious in practice, much more serious even than the intelligence activity against us, has been an extrajudicial financial blockade, completely political, no administrative process involved, set up by Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Bank of America, and Western Union. Those companies, all from the United States, and Bank of America being the original progenitor of MasterCard. We have an ongoing case against Visa and MasterCard in the European Union to try and put a stop to that. The preliminary finding is meant to occur sometime this month. But that has wiped out 95% of our revenue. Over 15 million euros, some 20 million Australian dollars has been destroyed as a result of that completely political blockade. But that has taught us something extremely interesting. It is not just about that WikiLeaks is suffering from something. Rather, we have been taught that MasterCard, Visa, PayPal, Bank of America, Western Union are instruments not of United States government foreign policy, but of the shadow state foreign policy, because there has only been one formal inquiry. And that formal inquiry gave its findings on January 13 this year by Timothy C. Geithner, the US Treasury Secretary. And he found that there was no lawful reason to add WikiLeaks to a US government financial blockade. So this has been done entirely under the surface. So everyone in this audience has, presumably in their pocket, a Visa or MasterCard. And you cannot vote with your wallet. In your wallet is an instrument of unstated US foreign policy, and it's affecting your actions right now.
That raises a few questions, and I'll go now to one of the questions sent in from someone here in the audience tonight. Peter Frey asks, or says, WikiLeaks has made a fine blow for freedom of speech, but one of the unintended consequences is that governments around the world have tightened restrictions around the flow of information. How do you reconcile that with the aims of WikiLeaks? And that question from Peter Frey echoes some of the comments made by Daniel Ellsberg in Andrew Fowler's book about WikiLeaks and you, where he talks about fearing a backlash, that governments will get more secretive to preserve themselves. What's your response to that?
That's part of the theory. Part of the initial theory of WikiLeaks, produced in 2006, was that we gamed for this case. So we looked at what the game theory was behind just this act. Could secretive organizations, once exposed, all go to oral communications? Could they take everything off paper? Could they balkanize themselves internally, compartmentalize themselves? Well, yes, they can do all that, but if they do that, their efficiency as an abusive organization will go down. They only have two choices. Be proud of what they do internally, so when it is exposed to the public, they can smile, or alternatively, they can balkanize. And if they balkanize, if they lock down, if they make it harder for themselves to communicate information amongst their entities, the result is they will be less efficient as organizations than other organizations that compete with them. They'll be less efficient than more open organizations. And you say, well, how does an intelligence agent, what's the competition for ASIO, as an example? There is competition. There's competition for budget. There's social competition. There's competition for high-quality employees. So there's always competition there. And you can either have an inefficient organization that is able to keep abusive secrets, or you can have an efficient organization that has information and activities that is not embarrassing when it is released to the public. So they can lock down. That's just fine by us. They can diminish themselves in this manner. That is part of the goal of WikiLeaks, is to have abusive organizations diminish themselves in a desperate attempt to conceal their activities from the public.
For that, the pressure needs to be kept on, and you said earlier that even if WikiLeaks is brought down at this process, others will step up to take its place, ultimately. Christine Lloyd and Rachel Simpson have a question flowing from that. It says, do you think the arrest of Bradley Manning and your own situation is deliberately discouraging others from leaking information and actively policing government? In other words, you know, will it scare off people from releasing the truths?
Of course, that is the pressure that comes to treat, to politicise the situation I'm in and the situation that Bradley Manning is in and his extremely abusive treatment in Quantico. Of course it is designed to put the scarers on, to stop people coming in our footsteps, but also not just directly in our footsteps. Remember, Bradley Manning and an alleged Swiss source that we had and myself and a number of our other people that have been harassed and detained briefly are all acting in a way that is defying the power of the leaders of these organisations that we are holding to account. It is an example of saying, no, you do not have absolute power in your position. And what the decision makers in these organisations become concerned about is not just, will there be more leaks? They become concerned about, will people do as they are told in the organisations? Will they just do as they're told at all? Will there be a mutiny in the US military on a whole range of other subjects? So that is the pressure that has been applied. And I'm sure that that has frightened some people. But on the other hand, we have also set a tremendously positive example in that you can actually achieve significant change. You can actually do it. There was a time not so long ago when people thought that if they really didn't like the situation, if they were really desperate with their life in an institution like the post office or the military, their only option was to go and shoot themselves or to go and shoot someone else or to be placed in prison if they tried to leave. There are other options now. There, of course, if one doesn't go about matters very carefully and secretively, there's a risk in those options. But the risk is not necessarily greater than people are willing to take who strongly believe in a particular course of action, who strongly desire to see something changed.
That goes to the question from Graham Bradley in the audience tonight, who asked, what practical steps does WikiLeaks take and what ethical principles does WikiLeaks apply to ensure that in obtaining confidential and classified information, it does not intentionally or unwittingly encourage or induce individuals to break their contractual duties or oaths of office, thereby exposing them to potential criminal and civil jeopardy? Or is that the whole point?
Well, this is a complex issue. It depends on a case-by-case basis. I mean, yeah, well, there's a particular attack that in order to try and embroil us and in fact scare the rest of the US media into not asking sources for information, the Pentagon has tried to imply interpretation of the US Espionage Act, which says that, falsely, but this is their interpretation. If a journalist asks for any information from someone who works for the government and it is classified and it comes to them, then that is conspiracy to commit espionage because you engaged in some kind of conversation. This is one of the reasons that the New York Times has fought so hard to distance itself, because at this very point there is a grand jury sitting in Washington, Virginia, trying to indict me for conspiracy to commit espionage. Now, if I am indicted for conspiracy to commit espionage, they say it would be because I was asking sources for information. Then the New York Times, in collaborating with us in our publications, would also be part of that conspiracy. So one man's collaboration is another man's conspiracy. So that's a delicate legal issue about solicitation. But of course, if we go back to first principles, good investigative journalists have always acted this way. It is a new claim in power by the United States security state, a new claim in power that no one, journalists, wherever they are from, can ask someone to hand over material. That's espionage. That is their claim. That's a new statement, a very bold new statement. And organisations like the New York Times, in their rush to save their own asses, are in fact legitimising that arbitrary claim.
Julian, we've only got 15 minutes left of questions and probably 4 hours worth to ask you. So let's try and move through them. But a lot of people question the ethics of WikiLeaks, what it does, how it does it. And the recent dump of those 250,000 diplomatic cables in a rush because David Lee from The Guardian published the secret password that would allow some people access to them and not everybody. It attracted criticism because in the rush, WikiLeaks didn't redact all the names in the cables, didn't take out all the names in those cables. Some say this is irresponsible and will put people's lives at risk. And Bryden in the audience says, do you feel that is an acceptable price? And if so, why? We know the explanation, but is it good enough to have an explanation? Is that acceptable for the fact that people's names are out there in the public when they never wanted or asked them to be?
Look, we have to deal with reality, not fantasy. The cables were out 48 hours before we published them. They were being published. Anyone could download them whatsoever as a result of this disclosure by The Guardian. Now, what becomes that's just the only rational thing to do. If you want to try and preserve the ability of this information to create reforms, to stoke up revolutions, for the people who are even mentioned in the material to see what is said about them before their intelligence agencies all know about it. That is the only rational act. Now, what is interesting is how that obviously rational act is then spun. Why is that being spun? So when you speak about critics, who's the biggest critic of all? The biggest critic of all about this, who's been producing 3 articles a day for the past 4 weeks on this and us in general. It's the Guardian newspaper, the very newspaper that disclosed the encryption password, that's trying to save its arse from criticism. Then we see also the New York Times signing a statement that the Guardian, in fact the very journalist concerned, David Lee, the brother-in-law of the editor, signing a statement that he drafted, deploring this publication. So this is an example where particular players in mainstream media abuse their voice to protect their own institutional affairs, to try and gain market dominance, to try and protect their reputation from genuine criticism. And that's nothing that is new with this organisation. In fact, those people who follow WikiLeaks activities closely, and there are many in Australia, are startled by reading one thing in the New York Times or The Guardian or sometimes some parts of Reuters, and then they actually go to the original source documentation and look to see what really happened. And they can see that it's spun. There's a lot of spin concerning us. And in fact, we are an interesting lens into the failures and the biases of the mainstream press. Now, fortunately, that hasn't happened to us too much in Australia. Australian press has been, on the whole, pretty good. But the closer, in general, that the press is to the story itself, or to the society, to the powerful groups in society that is reporting on, such as the New York Times reporting on the activities of the State Department of the US military, the more it abuses its position. And so we have some rather interesting examples of that. Now that all 251,000 cables are out, and I would never call this a dump, this is 3,000 volumes of international political history over the last 6 years. It is the greatest intellectual political treasure that has ever been put into the historic record in modern times. Because it is so relevant, it is so large, it is so comprehensive. You cannot dump that. Dump is what you do to garbage. This is a treasure. But when we look at some concrete examples about how these media organizations, we look at some concrete examples about how some of these media organizations have behaved. WikiLeaks gives us that ability because we worked with so many different media organizations around the world, and they started with exactly the same material. And we have released now all, for the cables, all the primary source material. We can compare what did they release versus what they were given. What stories did they produce versus what information they received. And as a result, we can see the corruption, and there's no other word for it, the corruption within the most powerful English-speaking media institutions. For example, the New York Times redacted a cable that described a Reuters correspondent working for US intelligence officials. Now, it's one thing to redact the person's name. We don't have an issue with that. But they redacted the fact of Reuters working for US intelligence. That in Task Force 373, so this is a story I discovered in relation to Afghanistan, the US Special Forces Task Force, an assassination squad working its way down extrajudicially, a list of some 2,000 people, going out and killing them in Afghanistan. The Afghani government deplores the list. You get onto the list just by being nominated by some governor who doesn't like you or some US intelligence. You're not told if you're on the list. You can't get off the list except by being killed or people arbitrarily deciding. That's a serious business, so serious that the Spiegel made it their front cover. Serious enough for The Guardian to produce a story on it. And the very country that it concerned, the United States, what did the New York Times do? Well, the story was written for the New York Times by its senior national security reporter, Eric Schmidt, and it was killed at an editorial level. It did not appear. It was killed off. That's an example of corruption in the New York Times. Just recently, we discovered that the New York Times had redacted the fact that oil companies, Western oil companies, were being used to funnel money into politically connected Libyans. The phrase oil companies was redacted, not the names of people, oil companies.
But I need to
For the
interrupt
Guardian,
you there, Julian, because
they redacted it's redacted that Timoshenko had hit Timoshenko, the Prime Minister of the Ukraine. They redacted this phrase: Timoshenko hid her wealth in property and investments in the United Kingdom. That phrase was redacted alone, and it was the only thing that was redacted from that cable was that phrase.
And that's,
similarly, in Kazakhstan, that the Kazakhstani elite
Julian,
in general
I'm going to
were
interrupt
corrupt.
you because we're going to
The
run
Guardian
out of time
redacted
here.
that phrase.
But I just want to ask you, I accept that. I think it's good to point out the treasure in the documents, and it's good to point out the way they're treated. But here we are without the middleman, without the spin, straight to you. And the question is, within those 250,000 documents, some people are concerned of others' names being there in a way that will put them in danger. Is that a real concern? You've seen more of these documents than most of us, than all of us. Is that a true concern, and
Yeah.
are you concerned about it?
We were concerned about it last year. That is why we set up a process involving, in the end, 90 different organisations in over 50 different countries, where individual journalists who knew the local scene or human rights organisations went through the material, redacted it, gave it back to us. We published it simultaneously with the original stories so people could compare to see that the stories were accurate, that they reflected the underlying cables. So, yes, we were concerned about that. And that's why we devised a rather complex international network and all the logistics and software systems and contracts to do it all. And that was working rather well until this Guardian disclosure.
Sure.
That said, it has now been over a year and a half since the State Department became aware that we had the material. It's been 10 months since the first it's been 10 months since the first publication of that material. And the State Department has informed some people that it thought it might have been at risk. And we spoke to them once this Guardian issue with the disclosed password was brewing, the US State Department. And they were, well, what more can we do than we did back in December and February? So, yes, there are potential problems. Now that the information is public, there is also a little bit of defence, actually, for some of these people. In that, if something does happen to them now, it will be seen to be as a result of this publication. And so the United States will be forced diplomatically to try and intervene to protect them. Thus far, no one that any government, including the United States, is alleging across all our publications, including this recent release, has ever come to physical harm across 120 countries. Now, when you operate at scale, when you're dealing with information that leads to the fall of governments, that leads to people rising up, that leads to change in elections, of course, just like the Ford Motor Company produces cars, and it doesn't bear the thought, but it can predict that one day someone will die in a Ford motor car. Similarly, when we operate at scale, we cannot completely eliminate the risks that information could be misused. Neither can Reuters, neither can AFP, neither can any journalist who publishes something, neither can people who make computers, who make knives, etc. That is an inevitability of operating at scale. But you do what you can. And thus far, we have a perfect record in 4.5 years, which is actually, frankly, amazing to me that we have a perfect record. It obviously cannot last forever, but thus far we have a perfect record.
Julian, I think to get to your future now, and I think you said so far the captain has not gone down with the ship or is still with the ship. In the next week or so, I think it's possible the High Court in Britain will rule on your appeal against your extradition to Sweden to face those charges of sexual assault. Are you scared of what's going to happen next? And if you go to jail, what happens to WikiLeaks?
Well, Fran, first of all, I have to correct you. There are no charges.
But Sweden has said it will make charges against, press charges.
There are no charges.
Okay, I accept that. But the High Court, I think, is going to rule on your appeal, yes, next week or so?
Yes, it is. But it's a bigger issue. That there's now 251,000 references on the internet to me having been charged. I have not been charged.
Okay.
That is the bizarre situation that I have been held in detention for the past 300 and 6 days without charge, that I am being extradited, possibly, without charge. So that is one of the principal features of the judgment that will come probably sometime in October in the next few weeks. Mm-hmm. Is it right to extradite someone without charge, not for a prosecution, to have a mere government employee and not a court try and extradite them? So these are all great principles of general law. Should there be a separation between the executive and the courts? Should governments have to charge people before they can detain them? I wouldn't have thought this would be any question at all. That these are basic principles going back to the European Enlightenment, that you should not do these things, let alone the political interference with the case. But there's something like a 30% chance that we will not be given permission to appeal to the Supreme Court. Perhaps a 30% chance that it will be a total victory, and perhaps a 30% chance that there will be mixed points going either way.
If you are extradited, I think it's the fear, and it's what you stated in your defence, that you fear being then extradited to the United States. What do you say to the idea that I understand some are espousing, that you should do it? You should go to America and you should stare down your accusers. Is there any value in that?
Well, I have thought about doing this. It's not as if that we haven't played this scenario through. It would be a tremendous platform to speak about all these issues that we hold so dear. But let's look at the reality. The grand jury, which is sitting now and has been sitting since last year, trying to indict me and others for conspiracy to commit espionage, was chosen to be in Alexandria, Virginia. That is 6 kilometres from the centre of Washington, D.C. It has the highest density of US government employees and military contractors in all of the United States. The jury is drawn from that area. It also has jury selection rules that are advantageous to prosecutors. That is why all national security cases are held in Alexandria, Virginia. So the reality is that if I entered into this environment, bar a miracle, I would end up spending life in Supermax.
Well, Julian Assange, I don't think there's anyone in this room who hopes that is your fate. Good luck with that. Thank you very much for giving us your time tonight. I'm sorry I didn't get to ask the question from Nick, which was, out of all those cables, have we found anything fun, e.g. UFOs, Loch Ness, etc., but perhaps another day. Thank you very much, Julian Assange.
There is one on UFOs.
Julian Assange.